Rather like the man who came home one day and found his wife...
Oh, nasty. Yes, I've had it. You know I have. Gave it to Fred.
Not with my wife, you don't.
For years, The Benny Hill Show ruled the airwaves, loud, frantic, and impossible to ignore. But behind its runaway gags and booming laughter was a slow-brewing backlash that few saw coming. Then came one segment, a scene that didn't just push boundaries, it crashed through them. It wasn't the first time Benny Hill raised eyebrows, but this time, the reaction was different. Audiences flinched. Executives froze. And just like that, a decades-long empire began to unravel. What was it about this moment that finally flipped the switch? The answer isn't just in the sketch. It's in what it revealed. Stick around. This isn't just about what aired. It's about why it couldn't anymore. The global comedic juggernaut. At its peak, The Benny Hill Show was broadcast in over 93 countries, making it one of the most widely exported British television programs of its time. Its international success was remarkable not just in scale, but in its ability to transcend language barriers. This global appeal was largely due to its reliance on visual humor, slapstick, exaggerated facial expressions, sped-up chase scenes, and pantomime, all of which required little to no dialogue to be understood. While British sitcoms often struggled to travel due to their cultural specificity, Hill's physical gags made his sketches accessible and relatable to audiences from Tokyo to Toronto. The simplicity of Hill's comedy allowed it to bypass the need for translation or deep cultural context. Viewers in non-English-speaking countries could follow the plot of a sketch simply by watching the action unfold. Gags like a man falling into a pond or a character being hit over the head with a frying pan were universal. These kinds of comedic tropes were reminiscent of silent film comedy, with clear influences from performers like Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton. This universality made The Benny Hill Show a favorite for international syndication, especially in markets where British humor was not typically mainstream. As the years went by, domestic reactions to the show became ever more mixed. International audiences applauded the humor, but British critics and cultural commentators found the series more and more reliant on outmoded stereotypes, especially in the 80s. In Britain, the show came to epitomize a kind of backward humor that was in stark contrast with society's awakening to questions of gender and race. This dichotomy created a unique split personality for the show, admired abroad while being ever more controversial at home. Ironically, what did sit well with audiences around the globe right into the late 80s was precisely what created such ill feeling about Hill's antics in Britain: sexual innuendo, slapstick objectification, and racial caricature. This begs the question, does international popularity exempt a show from criticism in its country of origin? Today, the YouTube viewership and occasional retro airings in some countries indicate that Hill's style of comedy retains some appeal. But the question still remains, was that laughter worth the price of cultural insensitivity? Not everyone kept laughing, because as the world shifted, comedy's old tricks started feeling a lot less funny. Comedy versus cultural evolution. By the 1980s, the social climate in the UK and much of the Western world had begun to shift significantly. Movements advocating for gender equality, racial justice, and fair media representation were gaining mainstream momentum. What was once considered harmless innuendo or cheeky satire in the 1970s was increasingly being reassessed through a more critical lens. Benny Hill's comedic formula, rooted in visual gags, innuendo, and caricature, began to feel misaligned with emerging standards. Sketches featuring scantily clad women being chased, or ethnic stereotypes used as punchlines, stood out in stark contrast to the more progressive tone being adopted by both media critics and younger audiences. This evolution in cultural values sparked a re-evaluation of comedic boundaries. In earlier decades, comedy was often seen as a space where taboos could be challenged without consequence. But by the late 1980s, audiences were no longer as forgiving. New norms demanded that even humor be held accountable for the messages it conveyed. This didn't mean an outright rejection of edgy material, but rather a growing discomfort with jokes that relied on punching down, targeting marginalized groups, or reinforcing harmful stereotypes. In that context, many began to see The Benny Hill Show not as subversive or cheeky, but as outdated and tone-deaf. The most glaring demonstration of this contemporary gulf would probably be retrospectives, such as in one case of the screening of clips from Hill's shows on modern programs under the title, The Cancellation of Benny Hill. When exposed to such material, the young viewers would definitely react differently. Some sketches, such as the clever mishaps that happen and the unfortunate, awkward social experiences, would still find them roaring with laughter. But there it is. Other fair segments, objectifying women or mimicking a racial accent, would visibly show discomfort or disbelief. All of a sudden, it dawns upon younger age audiences as to how very much humor like that was popularly accepted, but which has very much become out of today's bounds of acceptability. So clearly, in response to such audiences, the shift is quite notable enough to demonstrate how quickly norms of comedy can evolve within just a few decades. As political correctness flourished almost entirely in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, old media were pressured increasingly to reconsider what would be fine for syndication or revival. The Benny Hill Show would have once dominated prime time, only to be quietly shelved or relegated to retro niche channels. Mainly, Hill's insistence on not changing his style only helped accelerate his demise. He kept churning out the same formula that had been successful for years, but he refused to change with the times. It opens a larger question. Does comedy have to change just like society, or does it belong in the audience's take it or leave it category? The rise and fall of Hill's Angels. Introduced in the early 1980s, Hill's Angels marked a significant shift in the tone and visual presentation of The Benny Hill Show. While Benny Hill had long used attractive women in his sketches, often as part of comedic chases or slapstick scenes, the Angels were presented in a more stylized and overtly sexualized manner, featuring dance numbers, glamorous costumes, and camera work that frequently focused on their bodies. The segments leaned heavily into aesthetics that resembled soft-core entertainment. For many viewers, especially critics and feminists, this wasn't just playful cheek. It was a step too far, signaling a departure from comedic intent into objectification. This shift was not lost on audiences or media commentators at the time. Critics argued that Hill's Angels lacked the comedic substance of earlier sketches and instead functioned primarily as eye candy. Feminist voices were particularly vocal, pointing out how the show's portrayal of women was becoming less comedic and more exploitative. The camera's lingering focus on legs, cleavage, and suggestive dance moves reinforced the perception that the show was pandering to male fantasies rather than trying to entertain a broad audience. In a cultural climate where women's roles in society and media were undergoing significant re-evaluation, these segments began to feel increasingly tone-deaf. While the show's popularity began to decline around the time Hill's Angels was introduced, the segments may have been aiming to modernize the show or compete with the evolving tastes. Yet, the move seemed to push away those viewers who had appreciated the show's balance of slapstick gags, character comedy, and musical humor. Instead of revitalizing the show, Hill's Angels pushed it further into its apparent past. an artifact from an era when women were predominantly seen as accessories to comedy rather than active participants in it. Their increasing frequency and significance in the show furthered the malaise that the show was losing its comic focus. By the mid-80s, the ratings in the United States had begun to slide, even as the show was still being shown internationally in syndication. This was partly caused by the cultural criticism surrounding the Angels, but partly also due to a younger audience now fitting into the mold of social criticism and perceptive alternatives to comedy. Hill's Angels epitomized everything that critics felt was wrong with the Benny Hill Show: gloss, datedness, and disengaged from the times. For many, their appearance was not merely a blind spot, but clear evidence that the show's old reliable formula was breaking down. Benny Hill versus alternative comedy. By the early 1980s, a new wave of comedians was rising in the UK, reshaping what audiences expected from comedy. Figures like Billy Connolly, French and Saunders, and Rick Mayall represented the emergence of alternative comedy, a movement that deliberately distanced itself from the conventional humor of previous decades. These comedians brought with them sharper satire, character-driven narratives, and a conscious rejection of sexist, racist, or formulaic tropes. As a result, Benny Hill's brand of slapstick and innuendo began to appear less like entertainment and more like a relic of a fading era. Alternative comedy wasn't just a new comedic style, it was a cultural response. Informed by progressive politics and a desire for originality, these comedians often used irony and meta-commentary to question societal norms. Hill's sketches, in contrast, were seen as relying too heavily on predictable punchlines, outdated gender roles, and exaggerated stereotypes. While Hill's work was still drawing international audiences in the UK, it increasingly stood in opposition to what younger viewers and critics wanted from televised comedy. She made her way into television. The young ones, and not the 9 o'clock news, were breaking new ground with more diverse casts, satirical sketches, and confrontational humor that examined real-world issues. Compared with those works, Hill's seemed distant and escapist, tending toward generic characters and visual antics without much comment. What had once seemed all-encompassing in Hill's sketches now appeared blatantly simple compared with the layered writing and self-awareness of this new generation of performers. While his creativity paved the way in the earlier days of television by exploiting the medium's visual format manipulations, Hill was simply unable to cope with the changing times. To put it a little differently, he continued working in a style that had previously distinguished him, but now only served to identify him as a member of the old guard. In this sense, Benny Hill came to be viewed not merely as a comedian and comic actor, but also as the marker of the generational division in British comedy. While alternative comedians were gaining recognition for their innovations, Hill was increasingly seen as someone who had become an anachronism, someone who, for whatever reason, had refused or been unable to change. Revisiting Hill's creative process. Behind the slapstick humor and risque gags, Benny Hill was more than just a performer. He was a meticulous craftsman. Many viewers may not realize that Hill was deeply involved in every aspect of his show, from writing sketches to editing final cuts. He often wrote scripts alone, playing out multiple characters in the same sketch, and took great pride in timing each beat to get the maximum comedic effect. His style leaned heavily on visual storytelling, and the precision required for physical comedy was something he honed with exceptional attention to detail. Hill's background in silent film-style humor wasn't accidental. He admired greats like Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, and this influence can be seen in his approach to mime and physical expression. He understood that facial expressions and body language could often land a joke better than dialogue. Many of his sketches featured no speaking at all, relying solely on pacing, timing, and visual absurdity. These silent bits demanded more rehearsal and tighter editing, which Hill oversaw personally. It's easy to dismiss these scenes as simple or crude, but the comedic rhythm was carefully constructed. The Benny Hill Show was, technically, ambitious. Hill often applied filmic techniques for comic effect, speeding up footage, playing gags in slow motion, or layering chase scenes with music to build tension for comic effect. Take the now famous chase sequences to yakety sax, devised not merely for silliness, but choreographed and edited with near-musical exactitude. The control Hill consciously exercised over production meant that the show struck a consistent comedic tone even over material that veered sharply into controversy. Hill's instincts for comic timing and visual cadence were advanced and often undervalued among critical perspectives that focus solely on subject matter. But this very control may, in turn, have condemned him. When he could have shared the bounties of fame with junior writers who had something to offer his show or adapt his comedy to reflect contemporaneous concerns, he did not. Like the others that thrived with changing norms and venues, Hill's show was stagnant. And that gives rise to a complicated question. Can a comedian be a technical master and remain socially out of step? Hill's legacy invites us to question whether it is appropriate to separate artistic technicality from the social messages it conveys. Even one of comedy's greatest icons saw something in Hill that most critics overlooked. But admiration doesn't always mean agreement. Charlie Chaplin's favorite comedian. It's been widely reported that Charlie Chaplin, one of the most iconic figures in comedy history, considered Benny Hill a favorite among modern comedians. According to multiple sources, Chaplin kept a collection of the Benny Hill Show tapes in his private archive, an endorsement that carries weight, considering Chaplin's influence on physical comedy and silent film. The connection between the two comedians lies in their shared emphasis on visual humor. Both relied heavily on mime, facial expression, and situational absurdity to elicit laughter, often sidestepping the need for dialogue altogether. Benny Hill's comedy clearly drew from Chaplin's legacy, but with a faster, more exaggerated pace suited to the television era. Where Chaplin's humor leaned toward emotional storytelling and social commentary wrapped in physical gags, Hill focused on rapid-fire sketches and punchline-driven visual routines. For Chaplin, comedy often had a message. Hill, on the other hand, leaned more into the absurd, sometimes veering into crudeness. Whether that difference reflects a shift in audience expectations or a divergence in creative philosophy remains a subject of debate. Technically, the Benny Hill Show was very ambitious. Hill often edited for the timing of comedy, including sped-up footage, slowed repeat gags, and soundtrack overlays for chase scenes to build the comedic tension. The yakety sax laundruggery wasn't just silly, it was cut and almost musical with total choreography. Hill's hand in production allowed the program to feature the same sense of humor without compromising its content, even as that content pushed boundaries. His instincts for timing and comedy and visual rhythm were very much ahead of their time, and most often underappreciated when reading the show on the grounds of its subject matter only. But that very control of creativity wound up probably being one of the major causes of his eventual downfall. Hill would neither work with up-and-coming writers nor dare add new thinking to his kind of comedy. Thus, his comedy eventually stagnated. While every other show changed to fit the new modes and new experimentation led to many forms, the Benny Hill Show remained solidly fixed on the original formula, posing a very important question. Can a comic be sexually brilliant and technically out of tune? This way, the legacy built by Hill will leave us without an option other than to debate whether artistic craftsmanship can, or should, be dissociated from the cultural message it gives. The sketches we can't show anymore. Several sketches from The Benny Hill Show that once aired on primetime television are now widely considered unfit for broadcast. Among the most controversial are those featuring blackface, exaggerated racial caricatures, and heavily sexualized portrayals of women. One infamous example is Hill's portrayal of Chow Mein, a character based on outdated and offensive East Asian stereotypes. The sketch included a fake accent, squinting eyes, and wordplay rooted in racial misunderstanding, elements that modern audiences have overwhelmingly rejected as racist and insensitive. The re-evaluation of these sketches reflects broader societal changes in what is deemed acceptable in comedy. What audiences in the 1970s may have viewed as harmless parody is now seen through the lens of historical marginalization. Hill's use of ethnic impersonations, which included Middle Eastern, Indian, and black characters performed by a white actor in costume, underscores how normalized such portrayals were at the time. Today, these same depictions are often cited as examples of punching down, where humor is made at the expense of already marginalized communities rather than from a place of satire or critique. It is reasonable to see Hill, then, as somehow a continuator, yet indirectly, a dissenter with regard to Chaplin's rightful heritage. The artist modernized Chaplin for TV audiences, one might say. His very editing mannerisms, rhythmic use of music, and sheer variety of sketches and techniques kept the action moving athwart the rapid changes in media consumption habits. His humor lacked that tragic pathos, which inspires much of Chaplin's best work. In the critics' eyes, this raises the question: was Hill carrying on silent comedy, or was he goosing it for a far less conscientious viewer? Yet there exists the stylistic gap and the appreciation Chaplin had for Hill, suggesting he did appreciate the technical skill of Hill and his mastery of timing, even if he did not approve of all his material. That distinction is an important one. It gives way to the idea of separating comedic form and comedic substance. Hill's mastery of physical humor and editing earned him the respect of an icon like Chaplin, but what that skill was used for has become the terrain of modern critique. Was Benny Hill Chaplin's spiritual successor, or an example of how comedic form can be divorced from intent? The answer to this question would vary accordingly with who weighs the greater degree of importance to the work: execution or ethics. When comedy dates itself. Benny Hill's comedy was once viewed as universally appealing due to its reliance on physical gags and wordplay. But as societal norms evolved, many of his jokes became noticeably dated. What felt broadly accessible in the 1970s, cheeky double entendres, leering glances, and exaggerated ethnic impersonations, now reads as misaligned with contemporary standards. The concept of timeless humor implies a comedic form that transcends eras, yet much of Hill's material feels locked into the specific cultural assumptions and gender dynamics of its time. This illustrates a broader truth. Even jokes that once drew mass laughter can become cultural artifacts, rather than evergreen comedy. So what makes a joke of its time? The answer often lies in the context that surrounds it: social attitudes, media gatekeeping, and audience expectations. In Hill's heyday, mainstream media reflected a more homogeneous viewpoint, and challenges to dominant cultural narratives were rare. Humor that leaned on stereotypes or sexualized imagery was not only tolerated, but often celebrated. However, as media diversified and marginalized voices became more vocal, audiences began re-evaluating what and who was being laughed at. Jokes that once served as unchallenged punchlines began to expose the underlying inequalities they reinforced. Hill's many gags, especially those relying on women as props or as racialized characters as comic relief, are now easily subjected to scrutiny since they do not fit with contemporary sensibilities. And this does not in itself make them spiteful, but at the same time makes them indefensibly unsuited to the label of timeless. Aging humor during the lifetime of Hill is not unique. It heavily applies to many forms of comedy once considered standard. However, it remains that some creators evolved with the times, while others, to use Hill's term, retained a formula even as it lost cultural relevance. Thus did his refusal to adjust his lens come to be seen not just as stylistic rigidity, but increasingly as a refusal to recognize shifting boundaries of respect and representation. It would only be fair to say when the joke no longer works, one criterion would be its social ramifications. While it may be excellently crafted, humor that primarily upholds once valued but now outdated and harmful social norms may lose its value. Another consideration is whether or not it resonates with the new audience that fails to laugh at the joke. Its purpose is lost. Hill's case manifests in a scenario where many young adults find sections of his catalog uncomfortable or offensive, not because they lack any sense of humor, but since the frame doesn't fit into what they know as the world today. Thus remains a major cultural lesson. Comedy is not a timeless thing. It ages, along with the reputations of those who once defined what made one laugh. Redemption or rejection? In the decades since The Benny Hill Show was taken off the air, the question of how to evaluate Hill's legacy has divided audiences and cultural critics alike. Some argue that his body of work, particularly its sexist and racially insensitive content, deserves to remain in cultural exile. Others believe that while the humor may not hold up today, it should be viewed as a product of its time, not as a target for modern cancellation. Among comedians, there's a split. Some see Hill as a technical genius whose influence on visual comedy is undeniable, while others feel his refusal to evolve makes him emblematic of the worst excesses of legacy media. Younger generations, particularly Gen Z and millennials, often approach Hill's work with skepticism or outright rejection. When clips are reintroduced through social media or documentary retrospectives, responses typically range from confusion to discomfort. The comedy, once considered cheeky or harmless, now feels regressive to viewers raised in an era more conscious of power dynamics, representation, and the consequences of punching down. For these audiences, Hill's sketches are less nostalgic than instructional case studies in how comedy can reinforce outdated norms when left unchallenged, while, in fact, a growing number of critics and historians caution against the absolute erasure of Hill from our past, arguing for a contextual rather than censorious approach in treating shows like his as cultural artifacts rather than ongoing entertainment. Such an approach would afford the preservation of the work, with disclaimers or educational framing, as an avenue for honest discussions about how far media and society have come, and how far they still have to go. It further allows room for the recognition of Hill's performance and editing skills alongside the work's problematic elements, without exonerating any. The real question, therefore, is whether to rehabilitate or dismiss Hill. That answer is likely contextual. If the purpose is to trace the evolution of comedic form and social values, then, in some respects, Hill's work still has analytical value. However, if the parallel aim is to entertain audiences by today's standards, his shows just don't match the contemporary mark. What is clear, however, is that redemption does not involve celebration. A recognition of merit and flaw is all it takes. In that sense, Hill was neither a villain nor a hero, but rather a complex figure in the history of comedy, whose reputation presents us with dilemmas concerning laughs and ever-changing ethics. Yet behind all the debates about his legacy, there's one side of Benny Hill that almost no one ever saw coming: the misunderstood comedian archetype. Behind the bawdy characters and risque gags of the Benny Hill Show was a man whose private life stood in stark contrast to his public persona. Benny Hill was known to be intensely private, almost reclusive, never marrying or courting the limelight outside of his work. Those who knew him off-camera described him as quiet, humble, and even shy. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Hill shunned the party circuit and celebrity culture, choosing instead to live a modest life, reportedly in the same flat for decades. This personal modesty makes the vulgarity of some of his on-screen content even more jarring. The paradox of Benny Hill lies in how detached he appeared from the very characters he portrayed. While his sketches often featured leering old men chasing scantily clad women or mocking ethnic stereotypes, Hill himself avoided scandal and controversy in his personal life. This raises the question of whether he saw his on-screen persona as just that, a character separate from himself. Some defenders argue that Hill was playing roles for comedic effect, not expressing personal values, and that his real self should be judged independently from the work. Others counter that creators bear responsibility for the messages they put into the world, regardless of their personal intent or lifestyle. That real disconnection of man from his material opens the avenue for deeper discussion about the separation of art and artist. Can the public tease apart performer from performance, especially while the work contains harmful or regressive content? Everything adds to the intrigue in Hill's case, for he is not just the talent of show, also the writer and editor and producer. Conveniently, his script is his message, and it's an effort to argue his output does not reflect at least some part of his worldview. On the other hand, where overt personal scandal is lacking, so complicated is this cancel, in the same sense we might be doing to others with similar content, but with much troubling personal histories. Ultimately, Benny Hill fits that stereotype of the misunderstood comedian and artist who created provocative, loud comedy while living in relative silence and isolation. He wasn't, to match, a provocateur off-stage or a pusher of political moralism. Whether that makes him more forgivable or aggravating is down to individual preference. But life does make a point about how sometimes comedy does not paint a very direct reflection of the performer. It's a mask at times. Sometimes it's a mirror. Hill happens to belong to those cases where the gap may partly explain why this legacy continues to draw so much fire in the present day. Adding to the complexity is how little Hill seemed to defend or explain his work, even as public criticism grew louder. Unlike many entertainers who push back or attempt to reframe their legacy in later years, Hill remained largely silent, offering no clarifications, no apologies, and no efforts at self-reinvention. Whether that silence was due to humility, indifference, discomfort with public scrutiny, or a belief that his work should speak for itself, remains unclear. But in staying quiet, he left the interpretation of his career entirely in the hands of others. That absence of response has only deepened the ambiguity around his intentions, making him not just a controversial figure, but an elusive one. An artist whose greatest mystery may not be what he put on screen, but what he chose to leave unsaid. His refusal to engage with the discourse about his legacy has turned Hill into a kind of Rorschach test, reflecting whatever the viewer brings to the debate. Thanks for watching. If this episode gave you something to think about, or just made you look at comedy a little differently, don't forget to hit that like button. Got thoughts? Drop them in the comments. We actually read them. And if you haven't already, Subscribe so you don't miss what we're diving into next. Speaking of which, the next video on your screen goes even deeper into the impact of cancelled comedy icons. Click it now, we'll see you there.